Welcome to Being Curious podcast show, proudly supported by Moss Skin, a UK-based skincare line infused with sea moss. Good morning, and welcome to Counselling Reflections and the podcast of Being Curious. So today's guest speaker is a dear friend, and if you see me now, I just feel very humbled to have her talk with us today about her journey in life and her philosophy and wisdom. So my dear friend is Sarah P. She is a published author. She has worked in media for like a zillion amount of years, and I think you could probably tell me more. I suppose I'm gonna have to let her describe who she is. But I think what I want you to take away from this is that actually we're all on a journey, and we have lots of different ways of looking at life through the lens of the choices that we make on those journeys. So good morning, Sarah. How can our audience get to know you? Who are you? What do you do? What is your work? What is your passion?
Morning, Cornetta. Oh gosh, it's such a joy to be here with you. It really is. And I never need an excuse to talk about certainly the work that I do, but how would the audience get to know me? I don't know if you've ever seen a movie called Eat, Pray, Love with Julia Roberts, and it came out quite a few years ago. I read the book. It was incredible. And basically, I'll just cut to this. There's a scene where she's in Italy. She goes to Rome for 3 months, and she's met all these beautiful Italian people, and she goes to her last evening to have supper with them all. And she's done so well learning the language that they say to her, you order the food. So she impresses them with her Italian. And then one of them says to her, what is your word? What is your word? One word that describes you. And she had to think of a word, and she said, we don't do this in America, but she thought about it. And they went around the table, and each of them described the word about Rome, about New York, around LA, and about each of them. And it really made me think when I watched that scene, what would my word be? And to sum up me in a word, it would be seeker. I am definitely somebody who learns, and I love to learn. I'm always curious. I'm curious about other people's stories. I'm curious about why I have the story I do. I'm curious about why people behave the way they do. I'm curious about why animals take to some humans and don't. I'm curious about why some days I get up and I feel tearful, and some days I feel full of joy and love. And so in a really brief summary would be, my favorite subject at school was history. I went off and did a university degree because I was passionate about stories. I wanted to learn about kings and queens and why people went to war and what happened. And my dissertation was all on the Holocaust. And so I found that absolutely fascinating and devastating. And then I discovered after university, I wanted to go into broadcasting. And I went overseas to study broadcasting and ended up staying for about 7 years in New Zealand. And I came back and also carried on in the media in London. But I loved media because it was also storytelling. It was finding out about people, what makes them tick, what motivates them, why are some people performers, why some people want to be behind the camera, why do these children want to be seen in this way, what story can we tell, how can we present this, how can we teach this, because I worked in children's television to start with, how can we teach this to children through story? And so I realized there's a theme emerging in my life, and then I will go into more detail about why I left the media, but then I had to work out what my story was and why I was in a really tough place in my 30s. And I'll go back to that later, I suppose, when we talk. But I ended up changing career after a significant run of bereavements. 3 significant people in my life died within a few years of each other. And it really made me reappraise my life and realize that I was desperately unhappy working in the media, felt very inadequate, was hiding behind my shift work and behind being busy all the time. And yes, I've been called in to work in live television, but it was all a big sham. I was really unhappy. And so after a really significant piece of therapy work with a wonderful therapist, which lasted 4 years, I then decided to retrain as an addiction psychologist, and I'll later tell you about how I've evolved into the attachment-based therapist that I am today. And I thought, isn't this interesting? I'm still learning about stories and telling stories. And, in my day-to-day work now, all I want to do is find out about people. What is your story? What is going on today that's difficult? Let's look at your story and understand what it is about your story that reveals why you think the way you do today, behave the way you do, believe the way you do. And then I've noticed that as I've grown in confidence in my practice, and I'm now 15 years into working in this new field, I tell stories, I tell analogies and parables in my work to try and get clients to understand or to see things from a different perspective. So I'm often will say to the recovering heroin addict, so let's take a cheese pizza. Okay, so let's say that half the pizza has this, half the pizza has that. Or I might say to somebody, okay, so let's say you've got a 7-year-old daughter and she comes to you and she asks you, or let's say that you were on your way to the circus, or let's say, and so I've noticed that storytelling and seeking has been an incredibly strong theme throughout my life.
I'm listening to you and I am smiling because actually I so relate to that. I so relate to that curious mind of just wanting to ask questions. And I always asked lots of questions when I was young. But I'm also relating to you from the narrative of being a Black woman born in the UK and the ancestry, kind of the storytelling, the oral history of my African self. And it's interesting that it feels like you've been Miranda'd, not by chance, because I think it's also been intentional, got to a place where actually from the other side, you were getting help and then you're now providing help. But the fact that your curious mind using the starting point of history and ending up in terms of addiction psychology has been really interesting. And then also, I suppose, involving into attachment. What was it about that transitioning part? What was it about your life story then that kind of lent itself to you wanting to become a therapist?
So, well, firstly, I had an incredibly powerful experience with a female therapist, but I think the turning point was my best friend of 20 years collapsed and died. She had a series of massive heart attacks. We don't know where it came from. She was 39 years old and she was on life support for a week. And devastating as it was, it really made me reflect on my life. And at the same time, my therapist at the time had said something to me which was so revealing and shocking and made me quite angry about my life. And that was, I had come from a family of high achievers. So my parents, my mother, I suppose you'd describe as middle class, my father, proper working class, had grown up on the roughest estate in Manchester. And he always said to me, I had a choice to go the route of crime or to go the route of hard work. And he went the route of hard work. And he was so determined that, he's so determined that we would be educated, his daughters, but also that he would make money because he'd come from poverty. So my parents were so focused on achieving and working hard and making money that, as difficult as this is really to say this out loud, I can't speak for my sister really, my older sister, but I know now that I was neglected emotionally. And so what I realized was the way to get attention from my parents and to be rewarded was to come home with good news, good results. Yes, I got the grades that you wanted. Yes, I've got into this club. Yes, I'm going to do this. That was the only thing that got their attention. And anything else was disappointing, or I was berated or belittled for. And so I had become a high achiever, but not necessarily because I wanted to be. Really, it was because it was my way of seeking validation from my parents. And so I'd grown up in this family where perfection was the only thing that was acceptable. if I didn't pass my driving test the first time, if I didn't get an A, my dad actually said to me once, if you don't get A's, don't come home from school. And so I knew that I had to be a high achiever or I was a complete failure. And so it was only room for perfection. I could cope with a lot of stress. I wasn't doing well, by the way, but I looked like I was coping with a lot of stress and pressure. And so I ended up working after university in live television. And the therapist at the time said to me, "Oh, so you work in a job where only perfection is acceptable. You can cope with a lot of pressure, and you are a high achiever, and everybody in that industry is a high achiever that can cope with a lot of pressure, that doesn't make mistakes in their job because somebody else is going to come along and take your job." And she said to me one day in a session, "Oh, so your family life, your developmental years have completely molded you into somebody that can cope in a highly stressful job that only accepts perfection and high achievement."
When she said that to you, what was your reaction? Did you get it, or was you angry or annoyed? Because sometimes when therapists tell us something that is the truth, or the core is close to the things, our secrets, actually it can be really quite hurtful.
I was shocked, but she nailed it. She was absolutely right. And I was so angry. And it's not with her, but with the fact that my career wasn't really something that had been chosen by me. I was only looking for a job that felt like home in a way, or felt familiar. And so I went through quite a period of months where I was so angry with my family and my parents because I felt I'd been molded into this person that could have gone off and done all sorts of other things, but ended up in an environment where I was recreating and replicating the malignancy of my childhood, which sounds dramatic, but I was recreating the adrenaline and the cortisol that I was used to at home. And once I'd realized that, my world and my desire to be in that industry collapsed.
Wow. I'm listening to you, and there's so much that comes up for me just listening to your story. But one of the things I'm kind of recognize that obviously within kind of families like yours, social services wouldn't be knocking on the door saying, "Okay, I think you've got emotional abuse here. You're neglecting your child." Working class families, children get removed. And then particularly within Caribbean, African families, sometimes parents don't understand that actually what you mean by emotionally abuse, when actually I'm providing very practical support. And this is how we raise our child. Once you was aware of the neglect and you felt quite angry, what did you do with that? Did your world collapse that you could actually deal with that information? Or did it open up more stuff to kind of hold?
It's a great question, Cornetta. So my world did collapse. I felt very betrayed by both my parents. I felt very let down. At this point, by the way, my father had long passed away. He passed away in my late 20s. And what my family will say was the cause of his passing in his late 50s was lifestyle cancer. That's what the oncologist told us. What I now know as a qualified clinician is that my father was an alcoholic. He was a high functioning alcoholic. So he worked very hard, and then he drank a lot of whiskey every night. He smoked very heavily too. And so it did open a world of questions around my childhood. I started to ask questions around all of my choices, what I wanted to do, who I wanted to spend time with. But interestingly, I noticed that I was somebody that not only in my career was replicating adrenaline and cortisol, I was doing it everywhere else in my life. So I was speeding a lot. I was running amber and red lights. I would drive with the petrol light on for miles, just taking a chance. I would pay my bills. I wouldn't pay my bills until I got a red letter through the post. I lived hand to mouth, and if I needed more money, I just put it on a credit card. I would do everything last minute. If I was due somewhere, I would take the very last train that would get me there on time, which of course it never did. So I was always late to things in my 20s and early 30s, and creating constant stress. And what I realized through my therapy, when I'd had this huge revelation about working in live television, was I realized that there were so many aspects of my life where I was generating adrenaline and cortisol and creating so much unnecessary stress. And guess what I was doing as a coping strategy to deal with the stress was overeating. Now, in my late 20s and early 30s, before I had more awareness from my first master's degree with you in addiction psychology, I would binge drink every 5 or 6 weeks. So I wouldn't drink very often, but when I drank, it was a write-off for the weekend. I would take recreational drugs probably every 2 or 3 weekends. And day to day, when I had to work and get up for things, I would turn to food. So slowly, this picture was starting to reveal itself in front of me, which was my childhood had an impact on me. And that impact molded the career that I've now shaped. And in order to deal with all of the stress that I'm creating in my job and in my life, in my daily life, I'm picking up all these strategies that aren't particularly constructive. And it felt like I was surviving. In fact, that is the word I used. I wasn't thriving in my life at all. And from the outside, people were saying, oh, you've bought a little flat in London. Oh, you've just been traveling in New Zealand for 7 years. Oh, you've got a master's. You work in television. That's so exciting. And I used to think, this is just rubbish. This is not exciting. This life does not feel good. I think I presented something to the world that was very different to what was going on privately. And because my family...
It's interesting. Sorry to cut you, because I think there's such richness there. When I'm listening to you, what's flooding me is actually the stories of our clients in terms of, having to grown up in families of origin where there was an expectation of them to do particularly well in certain things, and they actually would achieve what the family wanted, but they would lose themselves along the way. And that external validation meant that there was nothing behind the shell. It was a pure kind of emptiness. I had a conversation yesterday with a particular client, and I'm also listening to you kind of, you had to go through things as coping strategies to help you get through the day so that you could achieve, yet everyone around you couldn't see you. That it felt like, I'm listening, I don't know if I'm interpreting or misinterpreting what you're saying, but it feels like they didn't actually see you. They just saw the stuff that you could do.
That's exactly right, Cornetta. That is exactly right. And my family will describe themselves, I am sure. My mother and my sister would, at that stage in our lives, this is 20 years ago, would have described us as a close family. When my father passed away, it wasn't true. It wasn't true. We looked like a close family to the world, but no one was talking, no one was communicating. My sister, I will talk about her attachment style and my sense of her attachment style later, but she was somebody who completely retreated from the family and lived a long way away. My mum fell into significant grief after my father died. And like most people, I think when you lose one parent, you kind of lose both, because the other one, she just shut the curtains for 5 years. We didn't talk about my father within the family, and there was no physical time spent with each other because we were all living in different cities. And you're absolutely right. That is how I felt. I felt like I wasn't seen at all. I was really struggling. I wasn't coping at all. And I was very unhappy.
The other bit, sorry, Sarah, for cutting in, but the other bit I'm also kind of witnessing is that most of this kind of awareness started in your 20s and early 30s. And I can assume that probably people thought, oh, you're an adult, you should get over this. Why haven't you got the strategies to kind of cope with this? Whereas had you recognized this in your younger self, they might have kind of said, well, actually, you're a child. What do you mean you're having these feelings? Don't you know that you should be seen or not heard? I don't know how you feel.
It's interesting you say that, because when we started doing our training, I remember very distinctly there was a day when we went to college and we were studying anxiety in children, and there were 7 distinct signs of anxiety in children, and I had every sign. I remember going off for coffee or taking myself off for coffee and just weeping in the toilet because every single thing that the lecturer had talked about, that was my childhood. And so my parents were so misattuned that they didn't realize that when your daughter has sleep disruption, food disruption, psychosomatic illness, separation anxiety, wetting the bed, language struggles to concentrate. I had every single thing that you could assign, which obviously they didn't realize. But it made me really sad that my parents had talked about what an incredibly happy childhood we'd had. And I remember sitting in class with you and thinking there wasn't a single sign that didn't demonstrate that, that I was a very anxious child. And so when I went to them for any kind of need, emotional need, physical need, even practical need, I was told to go away and figure it out by myself. And my mum in particular would get very angry if I needed any kind of emotional support from her. And I get they were both overwhelmed, working 2 jobs, trying to work really hard. They didn't need any distractions or disruptions from us. So we had to be, or my sister in particular was a little adult. She very much looked after me. And we became very self-sufficient, and we are still today very self-sufficient women. But as I got older, and as you say, in my 20s, I didn't realize that the things I was doing were coping strategies until I went into the therapy. And then I started to unpack what had gone on in my life and what I had done to cope. And it was just revelation after revelation after revelation. This is why the diets didn't work. This is why I felt lonely all the time. This is why I felt sad because I was struggling with complex grief and I'd had no support. This is why I felt disconnected from my friends. This is why I wasn't having romantic relationships, because I was just trying to get through each day. I was hiding and I was just trying to cope. And I had a lot of shame around looking at my peer group who I went to school with or went to university with, who were all settling into relationships and marriages and starting to have children and buying houses together. And I remember going to these weddings and thinking, who would want to settle down with somebody? I don't trust anyone. I don't trust women. I don't trust men. And I remember saying to my therapist in my early 30s, I don't understand why all my friends are settling in their marriages. And she said, what makes you think that? And I said, well, how do we know who we want to be with at 30 years old or 31 or 32 years old? And she said, Sarah, they're not settling. They're securely attached. They are people who have dated, met somebody that ticks enough boxes, and then they look at that woman and that man and they say, I pick you to do life with. They're not looking for perfection. They know that doesn't exist. And what they're doing is they're picking something that they think is going to work, and then they're going to make it work. And they know there's going to be ups and downs, but they're going to do it together. And that was such a revelation to me.
Did that blow your mind? Because that's kind of interesting, isn't it? That actually
it blew my mind.
I can imagine, because you're thinking, actually, what the hell? Why are they picking these people to settle down with? But actually, was this something that you was craving and wanting for yourself, but just didn't believe that you could have because of the experiences that you had? Or was it not in your radar, but a real kind of, not necessarily a judgment, but just an observation that your friends were settling with people that you recognize our personalities change over time, and how can they change with that person?
Absolutely. And there was definitely judgment on my part. There was not a craving at all. I remember there has been later in life, but I was sat in these weddings thinking, you are all mad, because I was looking for perfection, and of course it's not out there, and I wasn't perfect myself, obviously nowhere near. And that was I was still trying to look for a romantic partner, which with the values that I had from my family, which was perfection. Only the best will be accepted by my family. And also, I wasn't that interested in seeing somebody. I wasn't trying hard at all to look for somebody because I didn't want to be controlled. I thought that they would misattune to me. I didn't think they'd pay me any attention. And the men that I'd been dating in my 20s, unsurprisingly, were replications of my father. So they were emotionally unavailable. So I had one template of man, and that was my dad. And my dad was emotionally unavailable, practically and physically not really around much. And when he did talk to me, it was rules, controlling, and no affection and no gentleness or tenderness.
Yeah, it's
that's what I expected.
Yeah, there's interesting there because I'm listening to you, but I'm also listening to, there's a part of you that is pushing back on that, knowing that that's, hey, even though you're doing that, I really recognize that pattern that I actually kind of was attracted to my father. He was really remote, not really interested, not really present. And I can see that there's a part of you that is doing that on an unconscious level, meeting these individuals. But there's a part of you that's, I'm going to say spunky, that is actually saying, hell no, I don't want that for myself.
Absolutely.
How did you deal with the cognitive dissonance? How did you deal with the different parts of you pushing and pulling on what a healthy relationship would look like, given that you had no referencing, but everyone else around you thought that was a really good template?
And you know what? That's such a great reflection, Cornetta. And I love that you've called it pushing and pulling. And pushing and pulling is a particular attachment style. It is a way of, you fear it, you yearn for it, you don't trust it. So you want to avoid it, but you also want to lean into it. So there's this kind of avoidance and fear and anxiety all wrapped up in the same thing. And so you're right. When you say, well, I was a bit kind of spunky and I just pushed it away. I mean, I hope I can say this, but a male friend who I grew up with told me in my 30s that I had fuck off tattooed on my forehead for most of my 20s and 30s. So, and he was talking as a man. He said, you're a great friend, you're great fun to be with, you're one of the girls in the group, etc. But he said, we knew not to come too close. And if anybody tried, they did get pushed away. And it was that I wanted it, but I didn't want it. But because I had not done my therapy then, and I'd certainly had no understanding of attachment, at the first sign of being let down or being hurt or feeling bruised by somebody, I would just retreat. I wouldn't give them a second shot. And I didn't know, I didn't have the language or the knowledge. I didn't know how to communicate with people about what I needed. I was in that very, I suppose, naive stage, and maybe you could call it immature, but I would call it insecure attachment now, because I see it all the time in my clients, where you think that if somebody likes you or loves you, they should instinctively know what to do for you. And that's absolute rubbish. And one of the first things I say to my clients now when they start talking about their relationships is, to be in a high-functioning, mature, secure relationship, you need to talk explicitly about what you need. Do not expect your partner to mind read. If you do, you are screwed. And it took me years to realize that.
I just want to kind of backtrack a bit, because I want you to just tell us about attachment, because you kind of raised it a few times in different spots. There's a part of me who wants to ask you, was your early therapy attachment based or psychodynamic? So that's something you could answer. But for those who don't know anything about attachment styles, and we've kind of raised it in conversation, and I come from a place of knowing, can you just kind of break it down? Why is it important? Why should anyone know or care about it?
Yes, Gonetta, it's so important. It is the foundation of the work that I do, and it is the thing that has given me emotional and spiritual and physical freedom. So every one of us has an attachment style. Every single one of us has an attachment style. And it is basically our relating style. It's how we relate to others and how we think about ourselves. And every baby develops their attachment style between 6 and 18 months. And they base their attachment style, whether they are secure or insecure, to put it very simply, on how attuned and consistent their primary caregiver is. So basically, I was at home with mum. I was the second baby that had come along 2 years after my sister, and my mum was not that attentive, not that consistent, and she would be there sometimes, but not most of the time. And so what happens is, over that period between 6 and 12 months, 6 and 18 months, we develop this attachment style. And very simply, it falls into secure or insecure. To put it in perspective, the latest data tells us that 52% of the UK population is secure and about 48% of the UK population is insecurely attached. So basically about half and half. Now, if you look at insecure attachment, that falls into 3 different styles. One is somebody who has avoidant traits, and we'll talk more about that later. One that has predominantly anxious traits, and then another attachment style, which is the least amount of people in the UK. It's about 5% of the UK population, is what we call disorganized attachment. Now, disorganized attachment, in the work that we do, in our clinical work, and certainly in addiction work, is about 80% of the clinical population. So we see a lot of disorganized attached people who will seek substances or get dependent on behaviors to self-soothe. What disorganized attachment is it is an extension of anxious attachment with unresolved trauma. So we can talk a bit more about that. So, and a disorganized attachment is as it sounds. It's disorganized because there is avoidant traits and anxious traits and fearful traits. So they feel quite chaotic in their head, in their relationships, and they can often act in a chaotic way. So basically, I did my master's with you in addiction psychology, and the reason I came to do an addiction psychology master's is because I'd had this 4 years of therapy with this person. Now, she was an addiction counselor. I went to her not thinking I'm an addict. I went to her because I was like, my dad was an alcoholic, I think. So I went to her so I could work out about dad and talk about dad's bereavement. But what became evident when I was talking to her is all the things I've told you, which is the strategies I was using. I certainly wasn't using alcohol in the same way my dad did, because I knew that dad had issues with that. I didn't smoke, but what I had done is I picked up food and occasionally recreational drugs. So I decided that I wanted to do this master's because I was interested in it because I wanted to work out why dad was an alcoholic and why does this happen to people. And to tell you a bit more about attachment then and how I moved into that, in my final year of our master's, we had to do the dissertation, didn't we? And I did my dissertation on female recovering alcoholics and relapse. And so I was linking relapse in female recovering alcoholics with developmental trauma. And that came about because my first internship, clinical placement, if you like, was at various addiction residential treatment centres around London. And I would be facilitating groups with a qualified psychologist. And what I'd noticed was people who were relapsing were triggered by their relationships. So their relapses were nearly always triggered by relational stuff. And so I was thinking, why aren't we talking more about this? We're giving them all of these behavioural strategies to not drink, we're detoxing them, and we're sending them back out into the world after a month of treatment. And then they're all coming back in. We call it the revolving door in addiction treatment centres, relapsing because something's happened with their boyfriend or their mum or their dad or their boss or something they're feeling about themselves. And so I wanted to do the study, the dissertation, and work out why it was going on. And I interviewed 7 women extensively about their experiences. And what I noticed was the narrative which linked them all was each time they relapsed, it was triggering developmental trauma. So I knew that I wanted to learn more about attachment, and then I went on and did a 3-year postgraduate diploma in attachment-based therapy. And so as I was starting to understand attachment more and the impact it had, it obviously helped me understand my own background and why I'd made all of these choices. So to summarize attachment, it impacts the way we eat. It impacts the way we deal with stress. It impacts the way we grieve. It impacts the way we form romantic relationships. It impacts the way we are in our friendships. It impacts whether we seek help or we're alone. It impacts how we think we can resolve conflict or whether we avoid conflict. It impacts when we drink. It impacts our exercise. It impacts our belief about ourselves and our self-esteem. It impacts what we believe about other people. It bleeds into every single aspect of our psyche.
And I think what I absolutely love about attachment, that it is borderless. That for me, as a Black, British, Caribbean descent, African heritage person, you could see that attachment works in Africa. You can see that attachment works in Israel or other parts of the world where children are born. I think when I think about attachment, the bit that I would be interested in personally is a journey around spirituality. I don't think it's kind of done that side of the work, but I cannot really understand why it's really important. Why attachment now? Because it's been around for a long time, hasn't it, in terms of the way that we look. We're in the third wave of psychotherapy when we look at the processes, and we've got 500 different therapeutic models. Why does it still stand up then? What is it about attachment kind of models or workings that just make sense in the room and personally for someone like me outside of the therapeutic space?
It's a great question. And often people will say to me, why are you an attachment-based therapist? Because people tend to have heard of CBT therapists, psychodynamic therapists, human-centered therapists. And actually, I think when I did the course and then I started to practice, it gave me a framework which was so useful, because if I could understand when a client comes to me and tells me that they're struggling with something today, or reacting to something in this way, or struggling to connect with people, or they're finding it hard to resolve conflict with their partner, or they think that their life is hopeless because they always fail, it really helps me and it helps them to understand, what do you believe about yourself and what do you believe about everybody else? And the way we can understand that is by tracing back to their developmental years. So my assessment is often, tell me about your relationship with your mum and your dad. Tell me about the template of their marriage or their relationship, if they were together or if they are together still. Tell me about any romantic relationships you've had. Tell me about any friendships you've had. Tell me about any previous therapy that you've had. How did those relationships end? All of them. Tell me who you go to when you're really angry. Tell me who you go to when you're really stressed. What do you do when you're upset about something? Do you speak to somebody? Do you go and get a glass of wine? Do you sit in bed on your own? What do you do to comfort yourself? Does it include people, or does it include things that are really isolated? How do you eat? How do you treat your body? What do you believe about your body? What do you believe about being close to people? How do you feel about intimacy? How do you feel about separation? And these are the questions that I ask in the first session to get a picture of their attachment style. And once I have a sense of that, and it's when you're experienced, and I've been doing this now for 15 years, you really know the questions to nail it. And the answers, obviously, that they give you a real sense of whether they are secure or insecure.
They are such beautiful questions, and I use some of those questions. I think listening to you, I think I need to use a lot more of those questions in those initial conversations. But I also wonder that most people are not even asked those questions in life by their friends, or actually when thinking about a romantic partner, we might not even ask them about the things that they are into and how they live their life. In a certain way, but these are really practical, key questions to ask.
And
to
the
understand
client,
how people respond to things.
that's right. And the client doesn't really know where you're going with it. But when they say, why are you asking me how I eat? I say to them, tell me how you've eaten the last few days. Now, if somebody says to you, well, I did eat dinner last night, but then I threw it up. Or I'm trying to eat less calories because of this reason. Or, well, I cook for everybody else, but not for me. Or I don't really have time to cook, so it's bottom of their priority list. These are really interesting answers because you're finding out what they think about themselves, what they believe about themselves, and whether they value themselves enough. Because food fundamentally is fuel, but it's also self-care. It's also love. It's also time and effort. So food is a really good question, certainly for the first assessment. But if I say to somebody, where do you go when you're upset about something? And if people say to me, well, I don't tell anybody. I usually can hold it together till the end of the working day. Then I go home and I eat, or I drink, or I cry, or I just cuddle with my dog. Do you call anybody? No. Do you have friends that you might tell about what happened when you were upset on Wednesday? Yes, I might tell my best friend on Sunday. And I say, how do you present that conversation to them about your upset? Oh, I only tell people when I've sorted it out after I'm upset. So you're not usually vulnerable with people in the moment? No. Why wouldn't you tell your friend on the Wednesday night when you were upset, I don't want to burden them, I don't trust they'll say the right thing? So already you're getting a sense that they don't trust that this person is going to be attuned to them. These are all indications as to what their developmental years experience was like and what kind of attachment style they have. Now, it's really important that we talk about fluidity in attachment. So people can move in their attachment style. We're not all the same attachment all the time. So, for example, most people look relatively secure, don't they? Walking down the street, most people look like they've got themselves together, they're doing okay. But we can have a slightly different response to different people. So I could be more insecure around my mother with anxious traits because of the way she is and the way she relates to me. She was quite volatile, she was quite unpredictable. So I always used to feel like I was on eggshells around her. My dad was very different to my mother. He was very shut down emotionally, quite avoidant, very avoidant, in fact. And so I would feel safer with him, more secure because he was more predictable. But I still felt a little anxious because he never really gave me any reassurance. So even though he wasn't emotionally available, I still felt slightly safer with him because he wasn't as unpredictable as my mother. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And do you know what's coming to mind listening to you? There's a truckload of conversations I need to have. I need to kind of speak to you again. But I'm just thinking about, how do people date, Sarah? Because I can imagine that on the dating sites of Tinder, Hinge, I don't know, all the other things that are out there, it must be really difficult to navigate, and these sites don't set you up to be able to have these questions. But also this culture of swiping left or right and not really getting to know people, yet we're so connected. So how do people kind of navigate these spaces? I'm feeling quite overwhelmed.
That's such a good question. And I would say that a third of my practice is men and women in their 30s trying to navigate online dating. The latest attachment research tells us that 90% of men on dating apps are insecurely attached with avoidant traits. So it works for them because they don't actually have to get too intimate. They can ghost people. They can be chatting to several people at a time. And so that a lot of the women I see in particular who come to talk about relationships, and usually they're coming to me in their mid-30s, they're worried that their biological clock is ticking, they're not going to be able to have children, they're out there trying to date, but all they're finding is men that aren't reassuring them, they're good communicators until it gets to the first date and then they drop them. And so it's an absolute minefield, I will say. And I will also say that I'm in my mid-50s now. I did a decent amount of online dating in my late 30s and in my 40s. And it's really hard. But as a woman in my 30s without any attachment knowledge, the way I dated and the way I was able to navigate and manage it was so different to a woman in my 40s who was an attachment-based therapist, because I knew the questions to ask. I wasn't upset when I was ghosted because it meant that person was avoidant and that wasn't good for me. I wanted somebody secure. If somebody says what they're going to do, so if their behavior aligns with what they say, this is a good sign. So I say to women, if they say they're going to call you at 8 and they do, this is good. If they say they'll meet you at that point on a date at 4 o'clock and they do, this is good. If they get called into work and they're going to be late, how have they communicated the lateness? Do they take responsibility for it? Do they apologize? Do they reassure? So there is a formula that I can help my clients with when it comes to communication. And it's often the clients will say to me, oh my goodness, Sarah, this is like a magic pill, because it's a way to get the best out of somebody whilst also being honest, being transparent and reassuring. So we can go into that in more detail later if you want, but fundamentally, it's acknowledging the other person to start with. Then in the middle, you say what's going on for you and what's changed, and you apologize. And then you end with acknowledging the other person and reassuring them. So I often say to people, if you go on a date and the person says to you, great night, see you again then, let's stay in touch. That is a bit of a small one, but it's a bit of a red flag, because a secure person will say, great night, why don't we should we do something next week, Wednesday, Friday? And if they don't know because they have to check their diary, the reassurance will be, I'll call you tomorrow or I'll text you tomorrow to set up the next date.
I think I'm listening to you and I'm really over-identifying here, because I think, having been on those sites myself, you can really... Not only I understand my own attachment style in those moments, because I don't do what I know that would be helpful for someone on the other side, but also I think earlier on in those kind of early dating bits, because I actually dated, at a time where you met someone at a dance and you had a lot of opportunity to kind of meet people again over a longer period of time, or decide that you're going to go and sleep with this person because actually that's what you wanted to do. And so I can see myself, or I can see people who are dating on sites not necessarily wanting to be open about what their intentions. So I agree with you. I think a lot of people that I know, girlfriends and even clients, will say, actually, I struggle in these spaces. I want to be open and honest. I want to kind of be in a relationship. And for men also who say, actually, I just want to have sex. And I think they should also kind of have spaces where they can openly say, I am not here to kind of find a partner, a life partner. What I'm here for is to actually kind of explore my sexuality or my vulnerabilities, or just have a friend. But no one is actually telling the truth in these spaces.
And
why is that? How does attachment play into that, Sarah?
Absolutely. And so that's how I coach my clients, is to be as honest and transparent, which they struggle with at first because they struggle to be vulnerable, especially people who are insecurely attached. If they are insecurely attached, they expect vulnerability to be met with rejection. But they start to learn as they take risks that they're going to save themselves a whole lot of time. And so I learned this in my 40s when I was dating, and this is how I coach my clients too, that you are upfront and transparent from the beginning. So you might say, I am looking for, I'd like something longer term. I'm not sure if that's going to be with you, but I would love to explore it, but that's what I'm looking for. And that you are honest and transparent at the beginning, and that you can ask that question of the other person. Now, they might also say, I don't know, I'm not sure. It is not the other person's responsibility to say exactly what they want. It doesn't matter what their answer is. The responsibility is with us ourselves. So that I would say to somebody that said, I don't know what I want, I'd think, okay, it's up to me now to choose to step into that uncertainty and to give it a certain amount of time. And I'm taking responsible for doing that, and I'm okay with that.
Say that again. So it's not our responsibility to kind of get out of the person what their intentions are going to be. Our responsibility is to say, okay, can I live with that? And can I deal with that? And if I can't, then it's my responsibility to either have an exit plan or to kind of share with this person, hey,
yes,
I need
because
this.
I have a lot of clients that come to me ranting and railing. They weren't honest. They didn't tell me what they wanted at the beginning. And I said, maybe they didn't know. Yes, but they should have known. It's obvious they didn't want to date. And I say, no, they can be in a place of not knowing. You can't force people to put a label on it. And if you do put pressure on, you're probably going to back someone into a corner and they say something just because that's what you want to hear. Your job is to deal with the uncertainty of dating. So if you're with somebody that you like, but you can see that their behavior is not aligning with what they're saying, or their behavior is not aligning with what you want, you have to decide how long you can cope with the uncertainty. It is not their job to manage your anxiety. It is your job. And you come to me and I will help you manage the uncertainty and the anxiety.
I want to ask you this then, Sarah. What is the difference between those who date online who are secure? If we're recognizing that there's a pattern in insecure, what do secure people do then, Sarah?
So secure people do date online too, but there are less and less secure people available from probably the age of 30, 35, 40 upwards, because they're the people, as I mentioned earlier, that pick someone in their 20s or early 30s to form a life with. So there are less of them on the dating app. So they are out there. And I will say to my clients, they are a bit of a needle in the haystack, but you will draw them out if you act secure. So you have to notice the behavior in others. So what they look like on dating apps is they don't just send a like or a hello or a hi. They've read the profile and they express some kind of interest in something on your profile. So they're looking for a connection straight away. They quite quickly move from online chatting to a phone call. They call when they say they're going to. They quickly then move to a face-to-face and they turn up when they say they're going to. And if they can't because something comes up, they communicate well what's happening and they offer an apology and they offer reassurance. These are people that will pay attention. They listen. They're not perfect. They're not robots. They get it wrong sometimes too. But if they get it wrong and they're clumsy, they will offer an apology and they will trust that you will be able to resolve it with them. They won't get it wrong and then bolt and ghost you. They won't be clumsy and then grab another drink and not say anything. They will want to resolve what's happened. They will want to reassure you. They will want to work it out. And often clients will say to me, clients that have been insecurely attached and dealing with a lot of stressful and difficult dating, people who are avoidant, people who are highly anxious, they will come to me and say, I've met this person, Sarah. They're a little bit boring, but they're really straightforward. And I'm not really sure if this is exciting for me. And I say to them, people who say, I've met someone who's straightforward and potentially a little bit boring, you've probably got somebody secure on your hands.
It's so interesting, Sarah, when you say that. Sorry.
And it's because they are so used to being adrenalized and those spikes of cortisol from their developmental years, from the insecurity, from not knowing where they stand. They think that's familiar. It's not. That is not passion. It is not excitement. It is adrenaline. It is cortisol. It is insecure attachment. The couples that are much more straightforward, or the people you date that are straightforward, I say to them, gather information. I say to my clients, some of them do it, most of them do it, some of them push back. But I say to all of my clients, give it at least 5 or 6 dates until you decide to walk away from this person. Give this person chance, because it looks good that you've got somebody quite secure here.
What's really interesting, I'm listening to you because I'm just thinking about those who date and they say, well, instinctively, I should know that they're the right person for me. And I think,
rubbish.
Absolutely. How is it that you know? Or or instinctively they should know that I'm upset with them, or they should know that I like this when you've never said anything to them.
Absolutely. And so sexual chemistry, and often people will say, I don't want to date anyone unless I have sexual chemistry. What they're looking for is an adrenaline spike, a cortisol spike. So of course we all want to date somebody that we've got sexual chemistry with, absolutely. But it's so interesting to try and coach people who are with somebody they say is straightforward, they're not sure there's sexual chemistry, to stay with that person and see if it evolves. Because what they do is, if they don't get that rush of or spike of physiological, I'm going to say adrenaline or cortisol, they think that there's no sexual chemistry. But often what that spike of cortisol is about is this person feels a bit on edge. This person is making me feel anxious. I'm not sure if I feel safe around this person. I'm not sure if I trust this person, or this person is reminding me of someone in my past. So sometimes the cortisol is mistaken for sexual chemistry and passion, and it's not. It's just that you're feeling a little bit unsafe.
It's really interesting you saying this, because I think also there's something about people assuming that they don't need to tell people what they need and want here. And that a secure person is able to say, hey, actually, I really don't like you doing this, that I really feel uncomfortable with this. An insecure person would often probably won't be able to have words or feel the feelings, but will not be able to say, I'm really struggling with the way that you kind of approach this. I'm also mindful that trauma could be in this storytelling as well.
Of course. Absolutely.
That can be in the way, isn't it, in terms of the way that we communicate. Given that so much emphasis is based on having good quality sex, how does attachment kind of view like improving someone's sex life, or when couples have been together for a long time and are quite complacent? Because we're now in a period where there are more people together who haven't had sex at all. Whereas before we used to say that most people were having, maybe sex up to 10 times in the year. But now there are couples not saying that actually they don't want it, but not feeling that they can have it, or they're privileging or being stimulated through porn. How does attachment kind of help those couples navigate spaces of intimacy and create that deeper understanding?
So your question is a great one, and it's probably another 1 hour podcast entirely just to talk about attachment and sex. But very simply, sex is a way of communicating. It's a way of relating to one another. And it is, of course, influenced by somebody's attachment style. So if a couple aren't having sex, then I wouldn't really even be asking about why they're not having sex. I would be asking them about any intimacy, any closeness. Are they talking to each other about things? Do they trust each other? How are they upset with each other? Is there conflict that's been unresolved? I would be asking about what's going on in their relationship before thinking about sex. But basically, some people talk about feeling resentful in sex or uncomfortable because they don't have a voice in sex. And often people who are insecurely attached don't have a voice in sex. So they're not talking about what they want. They're not expressing what they'd like. They're not rewarding the other person for something that they like or enjoy. And they're not telling the other person when there's something that they don't enjoy. They're also struggling with boundaries. So I will often have a client that will say, I don't want to touch their arm when I walk past them in the kitchen, or I don't want to hug them when they've done something at home that I'm appreciative of, because I think they see it as a green light for sex. So therefore, they've completely stopped being tender or affectionate with their partner because they think it's going to be interpreted as a green light for sex. So neither of them in that case, in that couple, are able to communicate anything between being completely separate physically and no affection to full-blown sex. So there's so much on that spectrum. There's tenderness, there's touching, there's flirtation in words, there's having a bath together, there's spooning with each other, there's watching television curled up on the sofa, there's just rubbing someone's arm, there's massaging someone's feet. There's so much on a spectrum between having no contact and sex. And often couples are either extreme. They either think they should be having sex completely, or they don't touch each other. And it's about communicating what they would like, where they are, what they're feeling like, what state they're in. But before that, for a lot of people, it's about, can we resolve something that needs to be resolved before we even start to get as vulnerable as touching each other or getting into bed with each other? And what I've noticed is, and this is not me being sexist in any way, or this is anecdotal. This is my experience in the consulting room. Women tend to want to talk first, communicate and resolve before having sex in order to feel safe enough to have sex. Men tend to want to connect through sex in order to be safe and vulnerable enough to want to do it.
I agree with you, and I think that's anecdotal, and I would say that was in my clinical practice. I also see that. And what's often really quite sad is that couples and individuals are leaving it so long to kind of deal with that kind of unresolved stuff that comes through the experiences that they've had. And I suppose then, how does attachment or understanding attachment enable us to have a sense of closeness or draw people to be able to open up? Well, I know that we can all benefit from having a secure person in our life. And even if we sit in the insecure camps in parts of our life, there's benefits, isn't there?
Absolutely. So we can learn. I mean, we can earn security, which people will often say to me, how do I become more secure? How does my boyfriend become more secure? How can my husband or my wife? So there are two ways that we earn security. One is we are either in a long-term relationship with someone that is secure, so we learn from their model and template, which doesn't happen for a lot of people because the 50% of the UK population that are insecure, they're drawn to each other. Secure tend to draw insecure.
Say that again.
Insecure romantically are drawn to insecure. Secure romantically are drawn to
That sounds very depressing, Sarah.
Yeah, so basically what we see is people with avoidant traits and people with anxious traits who are both insecure are drawn to each other like magnets. And so, but the point is, you can earn security through therapy work with someone like me, an attachment-based therapist, or being in a secure partnership. But half the population that are insecure tend to be drawn to each other romantically. So what do those couples do, or what do those people do? You can learn to become more secure by reading about attachment, by becoming more interested in what is going on for the other person and learning why the other person's behaviors are being triggered. So, for example, an avoidant person's biggest fear, and by that I mean someone who's insecurely attached with avoidant traits, their biggest fear is being smothered. So when they're overwhelmed with anything, life, work, a relationship breakdown or an argument or bereavement, sickness, whatever it might be, they tend to withdraw from people. And so what they tend to do is they tend to what I call lean out and cope by themselves. Now, guess what happens to their partner in that situation? Them leaning out spikes their partner's anxiety. And when they spike their partner's anxiety, guess what the person who's been drawn to an avoidant does, which is generally someone who's more insecure, anxious. They start to pursue their partner. Why are you leaning out? Why are you going out more? Why aren't you talking to me anymore? And guess what that person does? The avoidant, whose biggest fear is being smothered, they lean out even more. And so what happens is the avoidant person keeps taking these either physical or emotional steps away from their partner, and it causes their partner's anxiety to spike, and their partner pursues them. So in other words, the cycle just gets worse and worse and worse. Now, what I coach my clients who are avoidant to do in their partnerships is not step back, and that's really hard for them. I say to them, if you want to calm your partner's anxiety and you don't want your partner to pursue you, you have to lean in, not out. And all that means is just reassure them. So you can still have your space, you can still go to your man cave, you can still go to the shed, you can still go out with the girls, whatever it is. Just say to your partner, I'm struggling at the moment for this reason. I feel a little bit overwhelmed with what's happening at work. I need to go on a run by myself. or I'm sorry I'm quiet tonight. It's nothing to do with us, but we're okay. I just need a bit of space.
Yeah, it's about communication, isn't it? That I'm listening to you, and it's just about being vulnerable and kind of communicating. This is what's going on for me, so that someone else who's more anxious, preoccupied, doesn't feel abandoned. I'm just a bit curious about the disorganized attachment that flip-flops between anxious, preoccupied, and avoidant, because when they show up in a relationship, they often pair then, I assume, then with their anxious, their insecure attachment.
So what we tend to see with disorganized is, depending on where the spectrum they are, and if they're quite extreme with quite a lot of unresolved trauma, we tend to see that those people are romantically attracted to very avoidant partners. So because a partner, to deal with the volatility, the unpredictability, the chaotic strategies of someone who's disorganized attachment, when they're triggered, it usually takes an incredibly shut down partner to be able to stay with that level of volatility and not walk away. So often we see partners walking away, but when I see a couple together where somebody is acting in a way where they're behaving in a chaotic way, and the three distinct things that we see, certainly at the far end of the spectrum, if you like, that demonstrates somebody is managing their feelings in a disorganized way is bulimia, self-harm, and suicidal ideation. So those are things I ask about in my assessments always. Do you have a history of bulimia? Do you have a history of self-harm? Do you have a history of suicidal ideation? Because that's immediately telling you that somebody they recruit chaotic ways to manage their feelings. And I'm not going to say it's categoric, but it is a pretty huge signpost for the clinician that you're dealing with somebody in the room that has unresolved trauma. And so somebody that is bulimic and has a history of self-harm, or is cutting at the moment and has one or two or many or attempts at suicide in a partnership, in a marriage, you can pretty much guarantee that their partner is extremely avoidant, to have been able to stay in that relationship with all of that chaos. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we could kind of talk even more, because I think what you've just said is that actually sometimes we really do love some really beautiful, wonderful people, but they are not able to sustain a relationship. You really have to be quite a secure person who can kind of get that someone who's disorganized, okay, they can only give a little. And that sounds like really kind of a sad thing to say, but it's because of the chaos that this person is happening. You as a secure person can kind of recognize, well, this is my stuff, this is their stuff. And actually, I need to have really quite clear boundaries. And I might stay here with you, but I also know that I can go. This is
absolutely. And I think what you've just said is so true about there's some really beautiful people, absolutely, that don't forget for most people, for a lot of people, when they start a romantic partnership, it's exciting, it's adrenalizing, it's that people often feel reassured and safe because they're in that honeymoon phase where this communication does tend to be better. There's lots of desire to see each other. There's lots of physical and sexual connection. And so often people will say, but they weren't like this in the first 6 months of dating. And I will say to them, that's because they felt safe. That's because they weren't triggered. That's because their disorganized attachment style wasn't activated. And then their partners that come to me will say, but then we were bereaved, or but then they lost their job, or but then we had a miscarriage, or but then, the house sale fell through, or but then she wasn't drinking when I met her, but then she started drinking. And so what I will explain to the family or to the partner is, so there were these external stressors that have activated the person's disorganized attachment style. In other words, it's activated their trauma. And that's why at the beginning, they seemed really straightforward and steady because they felt safe. But now life is throwing curveballs at them. You're noticing what happens when they feel under stress. They revert back to their default attachment style, which is to deal with it in a chaotic way. So they start drinking, or they start over-exercising, or they've stopped eating, or you've noticed that they're cutting, or you've noticed that they're eating, but they seem to be throwing up, or they become very reactive in conversation. What you're noticing is that they're not regulating their emotions under stress, and that is an indication of the disorganized attachment style.
I could speak to you all day, and I would be very selfish to keep you for hours all today. But I suppose what I would really want to kind of understand, or I'm asking on behalf of myself and maybe to the audience out there. So you've told us a lot. We have an understanding from our conversations about addiction, about attachment styles, about the different types of the styles, how it shows up in relationships. You've kindly explored your own pathways into this space. It's a political question I think I'm asking. What is it that you want the world to know, or this country to know, or the space in which you sit in terms of the model of working? Why should we focus on attachment? Why should we consider this as a budgetable thing that we should the government should explore more in?
It's a great question. So my passion, and I don't know if this is a bit of a dream, is to set up an attachment academy. But basically, where more and more people are trained about this in the way that I've been trained, so that we can intervene earlier and earlier. The earlier you intervene in a family where there is insecure attachment, the more chances those kids have at not continuing and perpetuating the family cycle. So my golden ticket, if you like, my dream, is that the government sponsor clinicians to be trained who can roll out courses, attachment courses, for every young woman in their first time pregnant. So whether they are, whatever family they've come from, that it's as common as NCT. So those NCT classes that you can go and attend, that there is attachment incorporated into that. So people understand you are either insecurely attached or securely attached. And the way you can create your baby's attachment style is by this level of attunement, this level of consistency. And not every mother gets it right. We're not expecting every mother to be perfect. But the important part about mothering is that you know when to resolve. So you can still get it wrong with your kids. You can still get it wrong with your newborn or your baby, but when and how to resolve. And to let young women know, or whatever age women know, when they're having their first or second baby, that this is so important. This is the most important thing in the first 6 to 18 months of your baby's life, because it is going to set this baby up. It's going to set up how they grieve, how they deal with stress, how they express their feelings, how they eat, how they seek romantic partners, whether they have friendships that are solid or not, how they manage their anger. It's whether they are happy, whether they can resolve conflict. It is so significant. And so my political dream is that attachment has to be in the government's mind, where we get in there right at the beginning. We need to be teaching women, particularly women, I'm saying men too, if they want to get involved, but women, when they are carrying their babies, and say, this is your attachment style. This is how you either break the cycle, or this is how you create secure attachment.
And I think
bond with your baby.
Yeah, it just sounds like an amazing dream. And in some ways, part of that dream is already there within social care. If the training has a big amount of attachment, and systemic practice also comes from that space of attachment. But I also wonder, in terms of this big dream, how does it kind of reflect, how does it translate in other countries? Because other countries have different models of raising their children and parenting. And what increasingly, and I'm saying this as a Black practitioner clinician, listening to really beautiful pieces of work that I feel translate right across. I don't think it's a cultural difference or a cultural way of looking at things. But I also say there is a cultural difference and a cultural way of looking at things. How does this translate? How does attachment just work across the borders of the world, that human beings can kind of really take on board attachment ideas, but also look at their cultural values and perspectives? Because sometimes there's a disconnect, isn't there, within the Western ideas across to the East, and maybe not really exploring other parts of the world in which other people have different ideas about raising their children.
It's such a good question. And it is something that I looked at in the attachment handbook. What is the difference in the different countries? So I remember years ago when I was in my 20s, I think in my late 20s, I traveled through Eastern Africa for 7 weeks with a girlfriend. And this is before any of my training. I was still working in television. And I remember saying to my friend at the time, the children are so content. You never see a screaming child in Malawi or Tanzania or Kenya, because most of the African women had their babies and their toddlers, if you like, strapped to their backs. So there was constantly this skin to skin and this constant sense that mother is with me. Also, every time their mother would sing or talk, the baby would hear the vibrations of their mother. And so what I noticed is, and I didn't have a clinician's head on my shoulders then, but what I noticed is we went into schools, we took some pens and various things to a couple of schools that we went to visit in Arusha, which is at the foot of Kilimanjaro. And the children were 5, 6 children to one desk. They would share a pencil, they would share a book, and these children's faces were beaming. Every single one of them was smiling and happy. None of them were teasing each other. Everybody had their focus on the board. And when the teacher walked in, they would sing and stand, and they all wanted to be there. The kids were engaged. They were happy and content, and they were all, most of them living in poverty. And it was extraordinary to see the difference between an English classroom and this African classroom in this kind of very poor village, and to see the contented children. In 7 weeks, we never saw a screaming child. We never saw a mother or a father berate their child in the street. We just saw happy children. And what I realized as I trained in attachment is Western society has a very, very different model to African culture and probably I'd say Hispanic and Spanish cultures too, where the children is brought up in the family, where grandparents are involved, parents are involved, aunts and uncles are involved. And you may say that happens in this country, but largely in Western countries, it's an individualistic society where we grow up and evolve, and we're encouraged to move cities or go to where we need to go to work, or we go to where we need to go to because we meet someone or we want to travel. Less people are going to church these days, and so less people are staying around their communities. So what happens is people are growing up in Western society encouraged to be avoidant attachment. They're encouraged to be self-sufficient, to act on their own, to do it by themselves, to not ask for help, because that is what our society celebrates. People that are self-sufficient, independent. Look at you, you're great, you're successful. Whereas in Hispanic cultures and Spanish cultures and in African cultures, they don't leave the village. They rarely leave the village. They rarely leave the tribe. They rarely leave their local town. And they are surrounded by and encouraged and nurtured by many different generations. And so what I noticed is how held and safe and secure the children feel, how attuned their mothers and their fathers and their elders are. It's so distinct, and you're seeing children grow up.
You, and I think there's part of what you're saying. I think I really do agree, but I also am aware that of the clients who come into my practice who have had experience from back home and have had really kind of dire consequences, that disorganized attachment, the anxious, preoccupied states, the insecure bits because their families have come to the West and haven't returned and left them behind. So there is a narrative, but there is something about actually when you've got a community around you, and you talked about faith and kind of that understanding that something that's greater than ourselves and a commitment regardless of what faith model that you want to kind of be part of, is really useful. How did we get
Can I just wait? Say that again.
How did we get it so wrong? But you want to say something?
Well, I just want to say something, yes, in response to what you've just said. So I remember putting my hand up in my attachment course, probably in the 3rd year, and I said to my tutor, what happens to the people who are disorganized attachment or extremely avoidant attachment, who don't get therapy, they can't afford it, who don't have a romantic partner that's secure? What happens to these people? And how do they live their lives so isolated or so fearful? What happens to them? And she said to me, these are people that you will see in a community that have animals. They live by themselves and they have dogs or they have cats. So they will often seek attachment and invest in the emotional connection with an animal. The other thing she said is that we see, and that I would encourage if someone does come to therapy who struggles with relationships and doesn't want to go back to the trauma and look at it or resolve it, is these are people that you encourage to be on the periphery of communities. So they can just about cope on the outside of a church community or a cycling club, or is it a choir, or is it somewhere they volunteer, or is it an animal shelter? But she said, so what you want to do with people that really struggle with those one-to-one relationships and don't feel they have the capacity to do that is encourage them to nurture or volunteer with animals, and then encourage them to get involved in a community where they can dip in and dip out.
I so agree with you, but also the actual physical presence, because I think people think that I speak to my friend every day on the phone, or I've got family that live in Wales and I go and see them, ad hocly. It is the physical connection, it's that right brain to right brain contact that's important, and especially for women, isn't it? That actually we need that. So as much as I love speaking to you today and we're far away from each other, I get a great amount from this. I actually really need to be in the room with you having these conversations, because actually I think attachment is about that physical presence rather than the internet.
Absolutely. But if some people struggle to be in the room, if some people struggle with that one-to-one contact, which people with disorganized attachment do, or even avoidant attachment, then the dipping in and dipping out of community, where they can be in a room with 30 people at church, or they can be in a temple, or they can be in a mosque, or they can, be at a church hall or whatever, that they can get enough maybe to be able to support them, and that isn't also too frightening. Now, I have a sense that we're coming to an end, and you had a question for me. You asked me before we started, what is my philosophy on life? And there's something I think that's really important to kind of sum up the impact that attachment has had on me. And that is, as you start to work on yourself and realize what kind of attachment style you are, the biggest realization for me and for everybody I work with is accountability and responsibility. So what happens is, as people start to understand themselves and their history and the way they react, is to no longer be angry with the world or expect the world to turn up for their needs. The massive 180-degree turn that people make in the therapy and my realizations were that I am responsible and accountable for knowing what I need. Only I am responsible and accountable for expressing what I need to others. Only I am accountable and responsible for setting boundaries. And if there's no point being angry at the world or wanting the world to behave in a certain way. If I want change, change has to come from me. Because if I expect the world to change, I end up being a victim of the world, and my life becomes a victim narrative. Whereas if I completely turn the focus and the spotlight back on me and say, Sarah, how can you change? What can you do? What do you need to tolerate? Why are you reacting to this? What are your needs? How can you express them? Then you have total responsibility and accountability, and you're more in control of your life and your life satisfaction.
Oh my gosh, Sarah, I think I need to bottle you up and carry you around with me, because that was absolutely amazing. I want to thank you for actually joining us, giving your time to me and to our viewers and all our audience. on being curious with counselling reflections. I really want to kind of lament in all that you have said to us today in terms of, thinking about attachment in a way that feels so dynamic, that actually, feels actually I could take this with me and use this and have a blueprint in some way to live my best possible life. That I am responsible for the choices that happen to me. Yes, I have an attachment style. So what happened to mum? But actually, in this space as an adult, I can do a lot with understanding who I am. Thank you very much for being here with me on Being Curious. I really appreciate it. And please come back again.
You're so welcome, and I would love to.
Oh, thank you.